Well, if you have your Bibles with you, or if you have a Bible to hand or on an app or a tablet, it would be helpful to have it open as we think about the passage that we were reading in Luke's Gospel in chapter 23, and as we think about the words that we looked at there. This passage is about the crucifixion of Jesus. And the crucifixion is probably one of the best-known events in history. And it's probably also one of the most hotly disputed and divisive events in history. It sits right at the center of the Christian faith. It's essential to it. It really drives home the impact of the kind of the radical outrageousness of the incarnation. And without it, we couldn't have the wonder of the resurrection. It's a core part of it. Now, I said it's hotly disputed and it's divisive. Historian Tom Holland says that there are no credible scholars of history who don't believe that the crucifixion took place. He states that it is a historic fact that it happened. So why is it so divisive? Well, it's divisive because people can't agree what it means. They can't agree what it signifies and what was going on when it happened. It's divisive because we don't all see the same thing when we look at it. Everybody looks at it and sees something different. It's kind of like one of those optical illusions in some ways. Maybe not like the classic one that we have up there where, is it two faces? Is it a goblet and a candlestick? You might have seen the one where is it a duck or a rabbit? Who knows? It's not like that because they're designed to be ambiguous. They're set up so that there's multiple things going on there. And it's not even like the psych tests you get with the ink blots, where what matters most is what you see, because it tells you something about yourself. That matters more than what's actually there. It's more like these ones you get with the lines drawn in a grid and you're asked, are the lines parallel? Or where you're asked how many triangles you can see. And those of you who were around in 2015 might remember the dress. Does anyone remember that? A picture of a dress taken in Colonsay, which at the height of its population was being tweeted about 4.4 million times a day. Because people looked at it and they couldn't agree what they saw. Was the dress white and gold? I was looking at it this morning. Was it white and gold or was it black and blue? Now, what matters about that and why that's like the cross is it didn't matter what you thought you saw. There was a reality there. It doesn't matter that even when I looked at it again today, I am convinced that that photograph is a white and gold dress, because the truth of the matter is it's not. And the cross is like that. Different people look at it and they think they see different things. And some people would love it to be the case that what matters about the cross is what you see when you look at it. But what matters about the cross is what's true about it. What matters is not what we think we see. What matters is what is there. So today I want to look at three different groups of people who were present in this passage and who saw the cross. And I want to think about the different things that they thought they saw when they looked at the cross. I want to ask maybe how those three views are still quite popular today and whether we maybe see them sometimes that way. And more importantly, I want to ask which, if any of them, was right about what they thought they saw. So the first group that I want to look at, we see in verse 35. So in verse 35, we read about the first group. And we read there that the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." So the rulers sneered at him, and that's who I want to look at first. We're not looking here at the Roman governors. When Luke talks about rulers, what he's talking about is the religious rulers. They were members of the establishment. They were powerful. They had a lot of clout in their area. They were very influential. And some of them held hereditary power, the priests. Their power was handed down from generation to generation, and it was baked into society, if you like. They were born into it. Some of them, though, like the Pharisees, were not born into this position. They attained it themselves through influence they picked up through hard work, through study, through knowledge, and through placing themselves in positions of prominence. Today we would probably call them self-made men. One thing both groups had in common, though, was that they had influence. They knew how the system worked, and they knew how to work it. And part of their role was to maintain this tricky balance with the Roman occupiers who ran the country, who ran the area. They wanted to have enough leeway to be able to live and worship their own way, but they always had to be careful not to push it too far, because then the Romans might have second thoughts about just how long a leash they allowed them. They knew what they would have called the law and the prophets, what we would call the Old Testament. They knew that the Messiah, the chosen one, was coming. And if you asked them, they would have said that's what they were all about. That's what they were working towards. That's why they were trying to keep Israel on track. But in the meantime, while they were waiting for that day, they were comfortable. They were influential, they were looked up to, they were respected, they were powerful. They knew how the game worked, and they were quite happy to play it. But then Jesus comes along, and frankly, Jesus is a bit of a problem for these people. He doesn't fit their idea of what this Messiah, this chosen one of God, should look like. For a start, he isn't one of them. They pretty much expected Messiah to be one of them. He's not really anybody. He's a bit of an outsider. I mean, if you look at his background story, even the village that he comes from, it's a real two-bit town in the middle of nowhere, well outside the centres of power. I mean, at least Invergordon makes it to the news now and again, but he came from nowhere. He was nobody. He didn't have their background. He didn't have their heritage. But what he did have was a tendency to make trouble for them. He asked them difficult questions in front of people, and he wouldn't answer their questions the way they wanted them answered. He called them out. He made them look bad. He was undermining them. And they couldn't manage him. They couldn't spin him. They couldn't make him one of theirs and take control of him. He just wouldn't be steered. He was a bit of a threat. He was a threat to their position and their influence. He was a threat to the fragile peace that they had with the Romans, to this delicate balance, because he was stirring people up. He was a threat to their comfort and to their way of life. So quite frankly, they decided that he had to go. They didn't want him. They tried various different ways to undermine his popularity, and when none of that worked, they conspired against him. They had him arrested, and they managed to persuade the Roman governor to sign his death warrant. And that's how he ends up on the cross. So these people, they look at the cross, and they see a problem solved. They see a challenger taken off the board. They look at the cross, and they see a threat defeated. Is that what you see when you look at the cross? That might sound like a really weird question to be asking here today. I mean, come on, you're in church, right? But for a lot of people, and sometimes that can be us, a living Jesus is just a little bit too much. He makes demands on us. He challenges us. He threatens to undermine our position and to undermine our comfort. He shakes things up. He shakes up our comfortable lives. A dead Jesus, though, a dead Jesus is a safe Jesus. A dead Jesus doesn't make demands. He lets us carry on in the comfort that we've become accustomed to. He lets us live our own lives the way we want to. I mean, maybe we can even afford to get a little bit of religion. And sometimes we might even quote his words if it suits us and if it suits our agendas. just as long as he's not going to ask us to make any kind of uncomfortable changes to follow him. Is that how you live? Is that what you see when you look at the cross? Do you see life made simple? Do you see a threat defeated? But there's another group of people I want to look at. Our second group, we would have expected them to have a little bit more insight into what was going on. The rulers, they had their training, their education, their background. These guys didn't have any of that. But they had an inside track. They had a special relationship with Jesus. They may not have had much theological training. In the book of Acts, 2 of them are described as being unschooled. They were a motley crew, but they spent a lot of time with Jesus. These were his followers, his friends. And what they lacked in influence, they made up for in closeness to him. They'd had extra teaching, close-up teaching. He'd explained his parables to them. He'd even outlined to them what was going to happen. So surely when they look at the cross, they're going to see things differently. Well, if we look at verse 49, we see that whatever they saw it from a distance. They stood watching at a distance. And after these verses, in the next few verses, they take Jesus' body and they bury him. Because that's what you do when someone's dead. It's pretty final though, isn't it? The previous chapter, in chapter 22, Jesus' closest friend and one of his closest followers, Peter, denied even knowing him. And in the next chapter, in chapter 24, we meet two despondent disciples on the road to Emmaus, and when asked why they look so glum, they say, because the one we thought was the hope of Israel is dead. In spite of all the extra teaching they've had, in spite of Jesus laying things out for them and telling them this was coming, this wasn't what they expected. It wasn't what they had hoped for. So what did they see? Well, they saw the man they had placed all their hope in, beaten and bloody. They saw the guy they had called master and teacher. They saw him arrested and tortured to death like a common rebel or a criminal. They saw the one who had said, "Follow me," hanging on a cross. They saw their dreams crushed. They saw the enemy triumphant. And they saw hope defeated. Hope defeated. Is that what you see? Do you wish the Bible had the answers to life's problems? But sometimes you can't help thinking it's had its day. Do you maybe get taken in by the lie that science has silenced God? Do you like the sound of Christianity, but frankly you're not convinced that it has much of a future? Maybe you are following Jesus, but there's a little bit of you that doesn't see how it can end well. You see your faith almost as a kind of a desperate battle, a last-ditch battle against the forces of so-called progress. Maybe you don't think that way all the time, but maybe sometimes that's how we feel. We're fighting the good fight, but we feel like the battle's already lost. We are, in the words of one of the characters from Dad's Army, doomed. Is that what you see when you look at the cross? Do you see a weak God? Do you see hope defeated? But that's not all we have. Because there is a third perspective on the cross. All four Gospels tell us that Jesus was crucified between two other men. But Luke tells us a little bit more. He's got a unique take, a really extraordinary interaction between Jesus and one of these men. Now, if we've got gaps in our knowledge about Jesus' followers, we know even less about this man. Depending on your translation that you're looking at, he might be called a thief or a rebel or a criminal, or if you're really old school, a malefactor. There's a word we need to bring back. They were not petty criminals, not if they're being crucified. These were bad guys. We can be reasonably sure he wasn't one of Jesus' inner circles because he's never been mentioned before or since in the gospel accounts. He might well have heard Jesus talking. He might well have heard him speak, so he might have known something about him. But he didn't have this insider knowledge that the disciples had. He didn't have that special insight. And he certainly wouldn't have had the kind of training and background and influence that the rulers had. But there is one thing that we can be absolutely sure that he was an expert on, that he understood better than almost anybody there that day. He understood what it meant to be crucified. First-hand experience. The Bible just says they crucified him. It doesn't go into a lot of detail. Its original readers would have known exactly what that meant, though. Now, we lose some of the impact when we read that, and I don't intend to get too graphic here, but basically, being crucified means hanging your full body weight from spikes driven through your wrists for hours in the sun until you die. Usually from asphyxiation because you just don't have the strength to keep dragging yourself up to draw breath. That's what this man was going through. And he knew that that's what Jesus was going through at the same time. More than the gloating rulers, more than the horrified followers, he absolutely understood what was happening to Jesus on that cross in those terms. He knew what crucifixion meant. He knew that realistically there was no coming back from that moment. End game. Game over. And yet something absolutely astounding happens. Something really amazing happens. And Luke tells us about that. Some of the other gospel accounts tell us that he started off by spitting insults at Jesus, just the same as everybody else. But then something happens to him. Something that changes his perspective on this situation. Something that changes what he sees as he looks at Jesus on the cross. Because he starts off by rebuking his fellow thief for insulting Jesus. And then he confesses that this cross is what he deserves, that he belongs here. He accepts his guilt. And then he turns to Jesus. And let's take a look at what he says to Jesus there. And you will see it in verse 42. He says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Remember me when you come into your kingdom? What? I mean, come on. Jesus is dying. And this guy knows that because so is he. As he hangs there on the cross, Jesus has never looked less like a king. But that's what he says. When you come into your kingdom, remember me. This guy whose time on this earth can be measured in hours, what he has left. He looks at the man who is sharing his fate, apparently, the man who is hanging beside him, and in the midst of all this death, he sees life. In the midst of all this despair, he sees hope. In the midst of all this loss, he sees salvation. He looks at this man being slowly tortured to death by experts, and he sees a king. He sees a kingdom coming in power. Where others see a defeated victim, a threat, or a hope wiped out, Do you know what he sees? He sees a king, victorious. Now, this isn't something he's puzzled out from the little snippets of Jesus' teaching that he's had and from the extra information that he's had. And it's not something that he's worked out through his great learning over the years as he's studied the scriptures and put them together. There is only one way that this guy looks at the cross and sees this. There is only one way. God has revealed it to him. God has opened his eyes so that when he looks at the cross, this is what he sees. And this request he makes to Jesus, remember me, it's not based on his heritage. It's not based on his influence. It's not based on his works. It's not based on any kind of previous relationship he's had with Jesus or anything he's done. On the contrary, he acknowledges that all he deserves is a painful death. He's not asking for his due or his right. He's asking for grace. Is this what you see when you look at the cross? Do you see a king coming into his kingdom? A king victorious? Because that's why we do what we're doing here today. That's why we have communion. That's why as we remember Jesus' death, we celebrate. We celebrate the king victorious over sin, over death. And if you've never called out to Jesus this way before, but if you find yourself now in the position that the thief is in, if you find yourself thinking, I have nothing that I can do to earn this. I don't deserve to be part of Jesus' kingdom. If you are just now looking at Jesus and you are seeing a king, then this is an amazing story for you. This is awesome. This is good news. And what's even better is what happens next. Because Jesus replies. And when he replies, he doesn't look at the guy and say, "You? I don't think so. I know you." And he doesn't say, "Well, okay, let's see what we can work out," and put him on some kind of probation. He doesn't give him a 12-step plan. And he doesn't even say, "Do you know what? I can work miracles. You're going to get another chance. I'm giving you another chance to get out there and put things right and do things better this time." He doesn't do any of that. What does Jesus do? He turns around to him and he says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Today. For anyone who calls on Jesus, for anyone who recognizes their need of him, for anyone who looks at him and sees the King and says, "Oh, Jesus, be my King." Today is when he takes you into his kingdom. Not sometime down the line, not when you've proved yourself, not when you've ticked all the right boxes and filled in all the right forms. Today. And there's something else amazing about what Jesus says, and it's one little word that's very easy to miss out on and to lose track of. With "today you will be with me in paradise." Now what's strange about that, Luke's Gospel is written in Greek. Paradise isn't a Greek word. Jesus would have spoken Aramaic or Hebrew. Paradise isn't an Aramaic or a Hebrew word either. There were words for heaven in all those languages, and they could have used any of them. But instead, he uses a word borrowed from Persian. Paradise. Do you know what it means? It means the royal pleasure gardens. The king's garden. Now, I used this illustration a few days ago. If you turn up at a house and I'm standing at the door and I say, "Come in, you're welcome," whose house is it? It better be mine or there's going to be trouble, right? I can't invite you into someone else's house. And nobody but the king gets to invite you into the king's garden. He doesn't just say, "Welcome to the kingdom, servants' quarters that way." He says, with me in paradise, in the pleasure gardens. In a few minutes, we're going to be celebrating communion. We're going to take bread and we're going to take wine as we remember Jesus' death for us. And quite often we call that the Lord's Supper or the Lord's table in traditional circles. And that's a good name for it. But it could equally be called the King's Feast, the King's Table. And once again, nobody gets to invite you to the King's banquet table, the King's Feast, except the King and those speaking on his behalf. And the thing is, Jesus doesn't just invite us to come if we would like to. Jesus doesn't just say, if you've got nothing better on, why don't you come along? He doesn't suggest we come to his table. He instructs us. If you are his, if you call him your king, and if he has said to you, you are mine, then he instructs us to come to the King's Feast together. As we remember him, as we remember his death on the cross, and as we look forward to that time when we really will be in his presence at his feast forever. Because he is the King victorious. What do you see when you look at the cross? Do you see a threat defeated? Do you see hope defeated? Or do you see your King victorious? What do you see?